The house used to wake up before I did. Floorboards creaked softly in the early morning. The kettle whistled like it always had. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested on the old sofa in the living room, the same sofa where I had spent years watching the world pass by. This house had seen my entire life. I bought it with my husband when our daughter was still learning how to walk. We painted these walls ourselves. We argued here, we laughed here, and when he passed away, this house became the only place where silence didn't feel cruel. Then slowly, it stopped feeling like mine. It started 4 years ago when my daughter and her husband asked if they could stay for a while. They said it would only be temporary, just until things improved, just until they found their footing. I said yes. At first, I told myself I was helping my child, that a mother's home should always be open, but weeks became months and months turned into years, and somewhere along the way, the tone in my own living room changed. The television volume was no longer mine to adjust. Meals were eaten without asking if I was hungry. Decisions were made without my voice. That evening, I was sitting in my usual chair watching the news quietly. My legs ached. My tea was cooling on the table. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt still. Then my son-in-law walked in front of the screen and turned the TV off. "I need the living room," he said flatly. "You can go lie down." "No, please." No pause, no glance in my direction. My daughter stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes lowered. She said nothing. I waited. Not for respect, just acknowledgement. It didn't come. Something shifted inside me then, not anger, not sadness. Something colder and clearer. I realized that I wasn't being seen as a mother or even as a person. I was being treated like furniture. I stood up slowly, picked up my purse, and walked toward my bedroom. I didn't argue. I didn't remind anyone whose name was on the house papers. I didn't raise my voice. That night, I left my own home and checked into a small hotel across town. Lying on that unfamiliar bed, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, I understood something painful but important. Silence, when ignored for too long, stops being patience. It becomes permission. And they had taken mine. The next morning, I opened an old folder I hadn't touched in years, and with it, I made a decision that would change everything. I woke up before sunrise, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my mind felt unusually steady. There was no anger rushing through me, no urge to confront anyone, just a quiet certainty that something had ended the night before and something else needed to begin. In the hotel room, I opened my purse and took out a thin blue folder. The edges were worn, the elastic band loose from age. Inside were papers I had kept since the day my husband and I signed for the house. Deeds, records, statements, all neatly filed, all still in my name. I hadn't looked at them in years. I used to believe love made documents unnecessary, that family would never turn into a question of ownership, that trust was stronger than ink. I dressed slowly and left the hotel without breakfast. The streets were quiet as I drove to a part of town I knew well, an old building with brass handles and frosted glass doors. I had worked around places like this years ago, when I handled records and filings for a living. Inside, a man with silver hair looked up from his desk and smiled faintly. "You don't come here unless you've already decided," he said. "I have," I replied. "I need my house back." There was no shock on his face, just a nod followed by practical questions. Names, dates, duration, no lease, no rent, no written agreement. "It will be straightforward," he said. "Well, serve notice today." By noon, someone else was standing at my front gate. Not me. I imagined the sound of the paper against the door. The moment my son-in-law realized the house he controlled was not the house he owned, the silence that would follow. My phone rang less than an hour later. "Mom, what is this?" my daughter asked, her voice sharp with panic. "There's a legal notice on the door." Carefully, I said every line. "But he's angry." "Anger doesn't change facts," I replied calmly. "Neither does fear." That afternoon, I made 3 more calls. Internet service paused. Television package suspended. The extra card connected to my account locked. I didn't cancel anything. I simply removed access. When the bank message arrived, transaction declined, I sat back and breathed out slowly. For years, I had supported them out of love, paid bills without being asked, covered gaps they promised were temporary. They believed comfort was permanent. That night, as I returned to the hotel, I felt something new settle into my chest. Not guilt, not regret, balance. They thought the notice was the worst part, but the real shock came when the numbers were finally laid on the table. The meeting was set for mid-morning in a room that smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. I arrived early as I always had. Being early gives you time to breathe, and time reminds you that you are not rushing out of fear. They arrived together. My son-in-law walked in first, confident in the way people are when they believe noise equals power. My daughter followed a step behind, her shoulders tight, her eyes scanning the room like she already sensed something slipping away. "This whole thing is unnecessary," he said before anyone sat down. "We were family. We were planning to move soon anyway." I didn't interrupt him. I waited until he finished talking because people often reveal more when you let them speak freely. "You said you were saving," I replied calmly. "Let's look at that." I opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside were printed statements, timelines, and summaries. Nothing dramatic, just quiet rows of numbers that told a very loud story. At first, my daughter frowned, confused. Then she leaned closer. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. "This can't be right," she whispered. 4 years of free living, no rent, utilities paid, groceries covered more often than not. There should have been savings, a future fund, something solid. Instead, there was almost nothing. Worse, there was debt, repeated withdrawals labeled temporary risky investments that never recovered, money moving out faster than it came in. My son-in-law laughed once, sharp and defensive. "Markets change. You wouldn't understand how these things work." "I understand records," I said. "And records don't argue, they don't exaggerate, they just exist." The room grew quiet. My daughter turned the pages slowly now, as if hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves. "They didn't. You told me we were close," she said softly, not looking at him. "You said we just needed more time." He didn't answer her. He looked at me instead. "You didn't have to do this. This is cruel." "No," I said evenly. "Cruel is letting someone believe they are building a future when they are actually standing still." The attorney cleared his throat and spoke for the first time in minutes. "The notice stands, 30 days, no extensions." Something changed then. Not in the room in my daughter. Her silence this time wasn't obedience. It was awareness. As they stood to leave, she hesitated just for a second, but that second mattered. She looked back at me, eyes unsettled, thoughtful, awake, and I knew whatever happened next, things would never return to how they were. 30 days later, I wouldn't be there when the locks changed, and my daughter would have to decide who she was really walking away from. I didn't return home on the day the notice expired. That was intentional. Some moments don't need your presence, they need your absence. Instead of driving toward my street, I went the other way. A small wellness center on the edge of town welcomed me with quiet music and warm air. No phones ringing, no footsteps pacing behind me, just stillness. At 9:00 sharp, my phone vibrated once. "We're at the property." Nothing else followed. I imagined the scene clearly without being there. The moving truck pulled up close to the curb. The front door opened and closed again and again. Items carried out. Voices strained. Not an authority, but an urgency. This time, no one told me where to go. Late morning, another message arrived. "Keys received. Inventory complete." Locks changed. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for years. When I returned home that afternoon, the difference was immediate. The house felt lighter, not empty, but unburdened. The living room echoed softly, like a place that had been holding its breath and finally let it go. I opened every window. Air rushed through the rooms, carrying away the heaviness that had settled over time. The curtains moved freely. The walls seemed to brighten even before I changed anything. I rolled up my sleeves. I cleaned slowly, deliberately. Shelves first, corners next. Then the floors, warm water, steady strokes. I wasn't erasing them. I was restoring myself. By evening, I placed my chair back near the window where the light always fell best. The room looked different without their furniture, but it felt right. A knock came at the door. Not a key turning, not footsteps entering. A knock. I already knew. My daughter stood outside, hands clasped, shoulders drawn in. She looked smaller than I remembered, not because she was weak, but because she was tired. "Can I come in?" she asked. That question mattered. We sat at the table with tea between us. No accusations, no raised voices. "I didn't go with him," she said quietly. I walked away. I nodded once. "That takes courage." She looked around the room. "It feels peaceful." "Yes," I said. "Peace comes when no one has to disappear to keep things calm." She didn't stay long. She didn't ask for keys. She didn't ask to move back in. She left as a guest. When the door closed behind her, I didn't feel loss. I felt space. But the real ending wasn't about the house. It was about what my daughter would choose once she learned the difference between love and control. The quiet that followed wasn't lonely. It was honest. For the first time in years, I moved through my own house without adjusting myself for anyone else. I made breakfast when I felt hungry. I turned the music up, then down exactly as I pleased. No one sighed. No one corrected me. The walls seemed warmer even before I painted them. A few days later, my daughter came by again. She knocked, waited, and stepped inside only after I invited her in. That simple act told me more than any apology could have. "I rented a studio," she said, sitting across from me. "It's small, not perfect, but it's mine." "That's how independence begins," I replied. She smiled faintly and wrapped her hands around the mug of tea. "I open my own account. I pay my bills now." Her voice didn't tremble. "He says you broke the family," she added after a pause. I met her eyes calmly. "Families don't break when someone sets a boundary. They break when one person is expected to disappear to keep others comfortable." She nodded slowly, like someone placing a final piece into a puzzle. From that week onward, Wednesdays changed. Few women from the neighborhood started stopping by in the afternoon, not to gossip, but to ask questions about wills, about accounts, about what temporary really means. I never lectured. I just laid papers on the table and spoke plainly. Kindness without clarity becomes control. Support without limits becomes entitlement. One evening, after everyone had gone, my daughter lingered near the door. "I miss the old you sometimes," she admitted. "The one who always said yes." I smiled gently. "I didn't change. I just learned when to stop." She smiled back. "Your no taught me more than your yes ever did." After she left, I sat in my chair and picked up the remote control. I turned the television on soft music. Nothing loud. I adjusted the volume once and stopped. Exactly right. No one reached over to change it. I turned the TV off myself and listened to the house. Silence, when chosen, isn't emptiness. It's space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to exist fully. That night, I wrote one sentence in a notebook and closed it gently. Enough is not cruelty. Enough is clarity. I slept deeply in my own bed, in my own home, knowing something important had settled into place. I was no longer asking for respect. I was living it. If you have ever felt small in a place you paid for, remember the moment you stop negotiating your worth, everything becomes quiet and finally fair.